Good morning on this rainy Monday morning. Welcome to our class on diversity in American politics, our 30th class, getting toward the end of the semester. When I first scheduled this class, it was back in December when I was developing the syllabus, and I thought for sure at this point in the spring we would be in the midst of a heated presidential campaign. Obviously, the COVID-19 had other ideas, and the campaign seems to have diminished. But I think it's still important to think about the role of racial politics in American elections with kind of a focus on the presidency. Not that the president alone has the impetus or has the impact alone on these questions, but that in fact they become a focal point, since that tends to be the election that Americans vote most often in, that represent the kind of greatest sense of what's important to the American electorate at any one point in time. So we're going to continue with that discussion today, and I've got a few reminders for you, and then we'll start the lecture. Thank you for submitting your papers on the Native American tribes. I've started reading them and have enjoyed them. I hope to have them back to you before the end of the week, when, as you will see, you have one almost final assignment to do. Upcoming classes for this week. Today obviously is an asynchronous class where I will ask you to watch this video. I've also posted 2 news articles as well as an NPR story. You could listen or watch any one of those as kind of a supplement, and then I will post 1 or 2 discussion board questions for you to respond to for participation purposes for today's class. Reminder to Jack and Sarah and Caleb that in fact your discussion questions for the first part of the Kramer book should be submitted by 11 o'clock tonight. And then on Wednesday we'll have a synchronous class and we will discuss the Kramer book, part 1. It is a slightly different book than some of what we've read because 20 years ago, I don't know that I would have included something like this, or if something like this was even written, in discussing diversity. The thought about thinking about rural consciousness as a new and diverse part of the American electorate was not even a concept 20 years ago. Kramer presents this to us in an interesting way, in a way that I think helps us to think about contemporary elections and the way that we are divided in American politics. On Friday, I'll do a little bit of a wrap-up on Kramer on either a video that I will do or one that I will ask you to observe that somebody else has done, and post another news article or 2 with a discussion board for Friday's class. I wanted to keep you from having too many synchronous classes this week because I realize you've got some back-to-back assignments here. I apologize for that. The shortened timeline of our semester has made that a little bit more difficult. Because Friday at 11 o'clock, your question and potential sources for your literature review on race in American politics is due at 11 o'clock. Again, if anybody's having any difficulty, having challenges with this, please do email me, be in touch with me, and we can have meetings to discuss. This is a first effort to think about this question. I will grade those over the weekend, and then the following week on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, we will have one-on-one meetings to discuss them more fully. So we will have additional time before you begin to finally develop your literature review yourself to have those conversations. Okay? So, race in presidential politics. I want to talk for a moment about theories of critical elections, which is something you might have heard about in American politics classes. It's premised on the notion that while every election brings about some degree of change, new people in office, potentially new issues, some elections invariably bring about a greater degree of change than others, and these have been called critical elections. V.O. Key, Walter Dean Burnham, the 2 political scientists that I note there, were instrumental in developing this theory. These elections are marked by a variety of factors, a combination of these things, not necessarily all of them. But all of them lead to the sense that the issues in the American electorate that are important might be different than the ones in the past. You either have the minority party becomes the majority party, so that those issues become the predominant ones in American politics. You have the majority party staying the majority party, but that the issues and coalitions that make up that party, the membership of that party, begins to shift. You have third parties arising, bringing new issues into the electorate, and you have an increase in voter turnout. All of this indicating some sort of fervor or ferment going on in the electorate in a way that shows that there are issues that need to be addressed in American politics, and that those issues are likely different than those that preceded it. So on this following page, we'll talk about those types of elections in a moment. It's interesting to note, and you'll see some of the dates on the next slide, that in fact these changes seem to come about approximately every generation. which shouldn't be surprising since each generation will bring with it new issues, new ideas, new concerns. And those get represented then in who they vote for and the kinds of issues they bring forth in elections, right? It's interesting, Thomas Jefferson once was supposed to have once said, I believe, that he really thinks there should be a new constitutional convention every generation so that every generation can commit themselves to the Constitution. I would say that perhaps our theory of realigning of critical elections helps us to bring about those changes every generation. We just bring about through the electoral process rather than amending the Constitution. This grid shows the 4 types of elections that the theory of critical elections say occur in American politics on a regular basis. Maintaining elections and deviating, the ones across the grid across the top, are the most frequent. Those are the elections in which you may move from, obviously, one president to a new president, but that there are not major shifts in issues, major shifts in political parties. When George H.W. Bush was elected after Reagan's presidency, there were certainly differences, and there were certainly going to be changes, but they were not the kind of major ideological or issue shifts that occur in some elections. Deviating elections, you may get somebody from the minority party who becomes president, but it's because of some sort of aberration. So that, for instance, in 1912, the Republican Party would have won the presidency rather than Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, except that Teddy Roosevelt chose to run against William Howard Taft, and they split the Republican vote so that the Democrat could kind of sneak in. Again, in 1952, when Eisenhower gets elected, he was so popular he could have been elected as a Democrat or a Republican, most likely. So the Democrats were still the predominant party, but Eisenhower was elected as the Republican president. The types of elections noted on the bottom of your screen, and I'm not too concerned that you remember these 4 terms, readjusting, realigning, deviating, and maintaining, but that you remember the concepts. So let's start with realigning elections over here. These are the ones that are clearest for us to see, where the party that had been the minority party becomes the majority party, and those issues come to the fore and become the dominant issues, and they stay so for a period of time. And so for each of these dates on here, 1800, 1860, 1932, you get major shifts in party leadership. 1800, the Jeffersonian Democrats, to become the Democrats, take over from the Federalists. 1860, the Republicans take over from the Democrats. 1932, the Democrats again become the predominant party. Question marks. 1992, was it that the Democrats were becoming more powerful again as when Bill Clinton won the presidency? Didn't seem to be the case in Congress. There was so much back and forth for a period of time, beginning in the late 1900s into the contemporary times, that the notion of whether or not a critical election was occurring was harder to see. Some have argued that that theory has outlived its usefulness for contemporary elections because political partisanship doesn't have the same kind of identifying characteristics for people as it did 50 years ago, although I think that might be changing back. The other problem is that patterns are really easy to see in hindsight, but they're very difficult to see when you're living through them. So both the 2000 and 2016 have question marks. And maybe when your children take this class someday, they will know whether or not those question marks get erased. The readjusting elections are a little bit harder to understand because you don't get this major shift in party. What you get is a shift within the party. So that while the Democrats became the predominant political party in 1800 with the election of Thomas Jefferson, by 1828, with the election of Andrew Jackson, the country had become much more small d democratic. More and more non-property owning white males were participating in the process and therefore bringing different and new issues into the election. So while it was the same party label, the issues and concerns of the people who make up that party had shifted. Similarly, we see that in 1896, right? 1860, the Republican Party had been the party of the Civil War. By 1896, the war was certainly not forgotten, but the major issues that they were dealing with were issues of industrialization, of economic interests. That was different than the issues that motivated the majority of Republicans in 1860. So you get these changes, and what those critical elections indicate is important issues and shifts, not just in who is governing, but in the way the American public is thinking, because they're the ones who are choosing these governing officials. So they're a good indicator of the way in which the political ideas and thoughts of the American public are moving forward. Well, they're moving anyway, whether it's forward is to be determined. So I use this as a framework in particular for understanding our elections in the 19th century or throughout the 1800s, because we can't talk about every election. They tend to be the ones where you're going to see the focal point of change. Okay. So before 1860, historians might argue with me on this, but I would say race played, this is relatively minimal roles as the nation grappled with nation building in 1800 and with increasing democratization and the new issues that brings about in 1832. That is not to say that racial politics were absent pre-Civil War. They obviously were there and they were building, so that by the time of the Civil War they erupted. But I think that they were kind of a underlying issue throughout without any kind of major eruptions during that period of time, and there were other things that the nation was dealing with. Clearly, though, by 1860, with the Civil War, race and slavery, whether it becomes the issue or one of the issues, depending on which historian you follow, became a key issue in American politics. In the race in 1860 and the several elections thereafter, it becomes an issue. It's also the election that marked what became a critical partisan divide in American politics that continued so for the next 100 plus years. And that is that the South became almost exclusively Democratic after the Civil War. It shouldn't be a surprise. The Republicans had been the party that had waged war against the South, and that after the Civil War maintained troops in the South for another 10 plus years after the Civil War ended, and so the Republican Party was despised in the South. And the South became a predominantly one-party region of the country, particularly since African Americans were not allowed to vote through the large majority were not allowed to vote through a wide variety of mechanisms post-Reconstruction. And so the South was almost exclusively Democratic. It didn't mean they were necessarily liberal, but they were anti-Republican. The Republican Party, however, begins to become the party that dominated in the North, and it becomes the party of black voters. Now, that's somewhat meaningless until more and more black voters get the right to vote, and it wasn't clearly so until about the election of 1936, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But that divide, particularly with the South becoming strongly Democratic, remains in place for another 100 years. 1896, issues of race recede within both parties, but I think the point that Michelle Alexander makes about this point in time is particularly interesting in that you had the potential for a coalition to develop among populists that included African Americans, that included farmers, that included factory workers, low-income working class folk who were banding together in a way to try and raise their power vis-a-vis the industrial and increasingly powerful manufacturing class in the United States. The theory that Alexander puts forth, and certainly some other historians ascribe to, is that segregation efforts were really efforts, at least in part, to act as a racial bribe, to break up this potential coalition of workers so that of black and white workers working together. My apologies for the typo there. So that with segregation, then poor white workers could at least say, well, I'm a little bit better than somebody else, right? To try and to appeal to that notion in human beings, rather than having people bind together, well, I'm a little bit better than the person below me, and using that as a racial bribe. And then clearly, in 1896, the Supreme Court gave its stamp of approval to the notion of segregation, and that continues for the next 60 years in American politics. This is hyperlinked here. Much of the data and some of the framework for the next couple of slides come from this article by Professor Timothy Hoffman of Seton Hall, an article he published in 2015 in Political Analysis that I think, for those of you who are interested in the topic, it's a pretty easy read. It's a nice summary of racial politics, race and political party in the United States that you might find pretty interesting. Moving into the 20th century then, we get this first critical election of the 20th century, which is the 1932 presidential election of Roosevelt. And Roosevelt begins to build this New Deal coalition of a somewhat iconoclastic mix of people: working class folks, union members, liberals, progressives, Northern African Americans, Southern whites, Catholic voters, Jewish voters, newly naturalized immigrants. A group that won't hold together or that will begin to break down into the 1950s, and then by the 1960s and 70s, we'll see, particularly as it becomes predominantly black voters' support and movement towards civil rights issues, you begin to lose Southern white voters. But at this point in time in 1932, you begin this shift, And what you see here is the shift with African Americans becoming predominantly the party that's going to support Republicans. We tend to think of that happening with the 1932 election, so that I thought these numbers were particularly interesting in that in 1932, FDR only won 23% of the black vote. I think that indicates that voters weren't yet convinced that they were going to be a part of this new shift. For black voters, the Republican Party had still been the party that had won the Civil War, the party that had emancipated the slaves. And so to make the shift to the Democratic Party, they were going to have to see some convincing elements that they were going to be included in this newly developing economy post-Depression. And so by 1936, I think they had seen some evidence of that. And in 1936, FDR won 71% of the black vote. And from that point on, the Democrats were the predominant winners when it came to acquiring the black vote in American politics. For FDR, it was helped because he had strong advocacy efforts by Harold Ickes, his Secretary of the Interior, and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, both of whom had been pretty strong civil rights advocates. Even FDR wasn't all that vocal about it. He had some people around him who certainly were. In 1948, we begin to see already the split in this New Deal coalition. Harry Truman, in what I think of still as one of the major victories in integration in American politics, he integrated the armed forces in July of 1948. And in that November, he won 77% of the black vote. I'm not necessarily saying those two things equate. Clearly, Democrats were already winning a substantial portion. But this was indicative of the move toward greater civil rights concern on the part of Democrats. Not surprisingly, then, we begin to see this rupture in the New Deal coalition, where Southern whites are less than enamored by this. And you have a pretty serious run at the presidency by Strom Thurmond, a segregationist Southern U.S. senator who ran for the presidency in 1948 and won 4 of the Southern states, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. So you begin to see this split within the Democratic Party as the Democratic Party takes on more civil rights issues. Southern whites start to leave the party slowly but surely. 1960 and 64, the presidencies of JFK and LBJ, John Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson. John Kennedy began the activity toward adoption of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. John Kennedy was a little more tepid in regard to civil rights. I don't think it was because of a lack of personal commitment, but John F. Kennedy was a New England liberal, as you all know, who had just barely eked out a victory in 1960. And as I've mentioned several times now, a large percentage of the Democratic vote came from Southern whites. And so he needed to walk that path carefully if, in fact, he really thought he would, if he wanted to be reelected in 1964 and not lose those voters. He was, of course, unfortunately assassinated in November of 1963, so did not get a chance to carry this forward. LBJ came in, though, and moved things forward. LBJ was committed to civil rights. He was also a really good politician, and he was a Southern senator who knew both the House and the Senate so that he could work things to make things happen. And under his presidency, with the support of certainly non-Southern Democrats as well as Republicans in the House and the Senate, they were enabled to act the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, probably the two most important pieces of civil rights legislation ever enacted in the United States, civil rights legislation for African Americans in particular. 1964, LBJ wins 94% of the black vote, a percentage that was unbroken until Barack Obama's election in 2008. He was also, interestingly, the last Democrat to win the majority of white voters. From that point on, the Republican Party wins the majority of white voters. He probably was able to do this still at this point in time because he was a Southern senator, had been a Southern senator. He was from Texas and was able to carry enough of the white vote from his connections in the South. 1968, and this is something that you learned about more in Michelle Alexander's book, you begin to see the adoption of the Southern strategy by Richard Nixon and those running his campaign, and appeal to Southern white voters with kind of a law and order theme, but which many people saw then and see more today, particularly when you can read the papers that have been saved from the Nixon administration, the kind of racially coded messaging that this theme represented in response to desegregation in the civil rights movement, an attempt to encourage law and order to counter the racial unrest that was happening and the riots that were happening in the streets in regard to civil rights and desegregation. This also then becomes the law and order moves into, as Michelle Alexander puts and sees it, the war on drugs as that develops. And so there's this kind of racially coded theme that happens beginning in 1968, and I'll speak in a moment that some would say continues to this day. It certainly continued in 1980 and 1984 when Ronald Reagan continued to adopt that strategy in some of his approaches and some of his policies and some of his statements. He wins the majority of the white vote and a very small percentage of the black vote. So you see that divide continue between the Republicans and the Democrats. 1988 to 2008, partially for sake of not making you sit for another hour and listen to me, I've skipped over this period to some degree because racial politics are a little less prominent. It doesn't mean there were not racial issues that arose. It didn't mean there were not debates over affirmative action, that there were not debates over the beginning of Black Lives Matter toward the end of that, not debates over questions of racial injustice in the criminal justice system, but that they did not become the predominant issue in any one race, although you certainly see uses of some of the same Southern strategies still continuing. The Willie Horton ad and the George H.W. Bush run for the presidency, perhaps most notably. And that division with the majority of white voters being Republicans and the majority of black voters being Democrats continues throughout this period of time. We certainly couldn't end, though, without talking about the last decade or so, with the major victory in 2008 and 2012, where Barack Obama becomes the first African-American president of the United States. And in 2008, as it shows here, he beat the LBJ record, winning 95% of the black vote. He also, though, interestingly won 43% of the white vote, which was the highest since Bill Clinton had won in 1996. So for 12 years, no other white candidate in the Democratic Party had won as many white voters as, in fact, Barack Obama did in 2008. The partisan division remained, though. Clearly, blacks were predominantly Democrat at large percentages, both in regard to who they voted for president, but also in regard to claimed party affiliation, while the same was true in the reverse of white voters. Not as high a percentage, but the majority of white voters still maintained their Republican status, both in voting for president and for their declaration of which party they saw themselves as affiliated with. You get this myth of the post-racial America coming out of the Barack Obama presidency, but I think these numbers clearly indicate that that was not in fact the case. We move to the 2016 election, Trump's election in 2016. There are two ways of thinking about race in regard to Trump's election in 2016. One of them is the way in which racial differences are promoted by the candidacy, and you see to some degree a continuation of the Southern strategy. This article, which I think you would find interesting if you're at all interested in this topic, the New Yorker Magazine article, compares the racial politics and the use of racial politics in 1968, Nixon's first use of the Southern strategy, to those used in 2016. You also have race from a perspective of the voter. And obviously there's a synergy between the two, right? And this is hyperlinked to an article that you might find interesting. It's a Vox article that summarizes some of the political science studies that had been done up to that point in 2018. I think this article came out. That while there's debate on this issue, many studies are finding that, at least to some degree, there was a motivation of racial resentment among Trump voters. Not the overriding and not among all, but that represented some of the motivation for Trump voters. I think that's interesting to point out, both because we need to remember that racial politics is an interplay between what the candidate encourages and does and what the voters do. It's also interesting, I think, to note because the question of racial resentment and its role in American politics today is a prominent theme in Catherine Kramer's book that we're going to be reading next. Now, moving into 2020, it's too early in the game to have had much political science analysis. There's been some pretty good news analysis done by news sources and some blogs and that like, but no real consistent studies done yet. I think some of the questions that will be studied when they do begin to look at these questions, when political scientists do, why did we end up with such a non-diverse small pool of candidates in the Democratic primaries when we started out with such an enormously diverse pool of candidates? Question I'm sure that's going to be looked at and studied in the years to come. What role did the black voters play in bringing Biden back from the edge of being eliminated? He was almost eliminated as a candidate, and then came South Carolina in strong support by black voters, and lo and behold, he is now the nominee for the Democratic Party. So what role was that? Did they play? I think there will be some look at the increased discussion of racial justice issues in this election, more so in some ways than Barack Obama did or could. I think as the first black viable party candidate, he, with all due respect for Jesse Jackson, and Shirley Chisholm and Carol Moseley Braun, that issues of racial injustice in the criminal justice system, questions of reparations were being raised in ways that I have never seen them raised in major debates, in major discussions by major party candidates of the Democratic Party in particular in this election. Interesting shift in willingness to discuss this challenge. And then, of course, you'll have ongoing looks at the Republicans' attempt to continue the kind of modern version of the Southern strategy. There's an article, I think one of them that I posted for you to read in conjunction with this video, about some look at some of the preliminary Trump ads that are being used for the 2020 election, and some ongoing racially tinged, at the very least, themes that they are using. So these, we don't have a lot of data on this yet, but I would predict these are questions that are going to be studied in the next 5 years coming out of the 2020 election. That's if we ever get past COVID-19. Last but not least, there's just a couple of grids of charts I want to show you. Most of this data, particularly on this chart, came from the Hoffman article that I mentioned earlier, but it's just a visual representation of the degree to which the Democratic administrations, the Democratic presidents represented in bold here, have in fact predominated in their ability to win the black vote, or have been supported by black voters, however you want to look at that synergistic relationship. And conversely, the degree to which the Republicans have lost the black vote, had been unable. So that while the Republican Party had been, the party of Lincoln for many years, and in many people's black voters' eyes had been a positive, that gets lost as the Democrats become the party of civil rights legislation, particularly around the time of right in here between 68 and 72 and moving into the 80s, when increasingly white Southern voters become Republicans and black voters, in fact, flock to the Democratic Party. Last but not least, this data was a little less accessible. I could get data pretty clearly up till back to 1968, and before that, all the sources I kept finding said that Johnson was the last major Democratic candidate to win over 50% of the white vote, but it never quite gave me a number, and I wasn't finding any. So, but this is just the other side of that picture, the degree to which the Republican Party has won the white vote in American politics, and the Democratic Party has lost the white vote in American politics. So that's a summary, quick and dirty, on, to some degree, the role that racial politics has played in elections in American politics, with a focus on presidential elections. I hope this and the couple of articles that I posted will give you some good food for thought, and I look forward to reading your comments on our discussion board. Thanks.